powers the neighborhood. The ash from the generator, the farmers use instead of lime on the fields. And the thing they're working on now is the question of the waste heat. The generator, the cooling water from the generator is warm, and they're asking themselves, can they use that now in aquaculture or possibly to heat a greenhouse? So we're beginning to see something in a little company like that, 20 miles from here, that resembles that circle, that begins to look like a sustainable way of living. And it's not that complicated, and it's not that difficult, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. So all of this, it seems to me, is these are all very helpful things. The final good news item, I guess, I wanted to mention. Recently, Paul Hawken, an environmentalist and writer who's been at this line of work for years and years and years, Paul published a book called Blessed Unrest: How the Biggest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why Nobody Saw It Coming. And Hawken got onto this because he would give speeches, and at the end of the speeches, people would be waiting to talk to him. And while they waited to talk to him, they would talk to each other. And he would overhear some of these conversations, and one guy would say, you know, I'm so-and-so, and I'm working on a project that has to do with sustainable housing. And the other person would say, I'm working on something that has to do with health foods, and somebody else was working on something that had to do with better uses of resources, and so forth. And they'd start saying, can I have your card? How do I reach you? And they started forming networks more or less in front of him. And after he'd seen this happen a number of times, he thought to himself, wait a minute, I'm looking at all kinds of little organizations that are 1 person, 2 person, 20 people, but also big ones like the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club and so on and so forth. And they're all working on these little projects and on these little issues. And they're the perfection of the 1970s slogan, think globally, act locally. But nobody's telling them to do this. They're just, each one of them is looking around and seeing a problem and tackling that problem by himself, in a way like what Bob Bancroft was doing on his own land, saying, I can do something right here. I can't solve the problem of the world, but I can solve this little problem. And with 10 of us, we can solve another little problem. And he started to ask himself, how many organizations of this kind might there be? And eventually he built a database. And from the database, he did an extrapolation. And he said between social justice and environmental sustainability organizations, he reckoned there were at least a million organizations in the world working on these issues, and maybe as many as 2 million. And that's the blessed unrest he talks about. That's the largest movement in the world that nobody saw coming. And he says, you know, this is the way we're going to solve these problems. This is the way we're going to turn this world around. This is the way the world gets changed, is by one person after another saying, I can't solve the whole thing, but I can solve this little piece of it. And if I get together with him, we can solve a bigger little piece of it. And if we all communicate together, we can pass back and forth the information and the inspiration that will allow us all to move forward. And this strikes me as being an absolutely wonderful phenomenon, of which this organization is very clearly a part. This is one of those million organizations. You're working on trout. There's another organization working on salmon, right? There are other organizations working on even all kinds of other different fish. But 1 million organizations around the world working on these kinds of things is going to change the world. I want to conclude with another story from Cape Breton, because that's where the good stories come from. This is a true story. And this is a story about Rankin McSween, a marvelous man who's the head of New Dawn Corporation, one of the most successful and admired social economy companies in the world. And Rankin likes to tell the story about being a little boy and talking with his grandfather. And in those days, in that part of Cape Breton, the men generally worked at home during the summer. They did some fishing, they did some farming, they did some wood cutting. And then when the fall came along, they went down to Boston, and they worked in Boston for the winter for wages, for cash, almost unheard of in rural Cape Breton in those days. And the way they got to Boston was they walked. They walked from Cape Breton to Boston in the fall, and they walked from Boston to Cape Breton in the spring. And Rankin heard these stories as a little shaver, and then he got a little older and a little smarter, as he thought. And he came to realize that not everybody was always telling him the truth when they told him stories. And after a bit, it occurred to him, he began to realize just how far it was from Cape Breton to Boston. And he went back to his grandfather and he said, "Grandpa, that can't be true. That can't be true. You couldn't walk. A man couldn't walk from Cape Breton to Boston. It's too far. It's too hard. It'd take too long. You'd give up on it. A person couldn't do that." And his grandfather said, "Rankin, boy, you're right. A man couldn't walk from Cape Breton to Boston. It is too far. It is too hard. It would take too long. You'd never do it, you see. But you see, a man didn't walk from Cape Breton to Boston. A group of men walked from Cape Breton to Boston. It wasn't just me. It was Big John and Willie the Dancer and Short Harry. And we all went together. We walked along together, and as we walked, we sang songs, and we told stories, and we visited back and forth. And you know, from Cape Breton to Boston, with a bunch of guys all walking together, turned out not to be very far at all. And we could do it very easily. I love that story, and I love that wonderful sense that the impossible becomes easy when you do it together. And if I've learned anything from this whole business of the worldwide movement of 1 million organizations, or maybe 2 million organizations, it's that it's becoming easier because we're doing it together. I want to say how pleased I am to be here, how happy I am to be speaking to a group of people who are part of that 1 million organizations. Bless you for the work you're doing. Bless you for being part of it. May you have every success in the future.